Okay, hi guys, I'm back again, and this time it's with a book review. And so the book that I want to talk about today is Ravencry by Ed McDonald. And if that rings a bell, it's because last year, or maybe it was early this year, I reviewed Blackwing by Ed McDonald. And Blackwing was one of my favorite fantasy books of the last year, and it was a debut, which is a little bit surprising because the writing was great, but the best thing was this guy just made up this whole new world, and I really bought into it. And so I was super keen, and I bought this almost the day that it came out, because I just loved the world. Now, the world is, I should say before I get into anything, I'm going to talk briefly about whether you should get this book, and you probably can already tell I think it's worth getting. But we'll talk about it, and then I will have a spoiler break, and then I will talk about some of the things which happen obviously towards the second half of this book. So, should you get this book? If you are at all into fantasy, especially grimdark, then this is a really, really good book to get. And the reason I say that is, going on from what I said before, this world that this guy has imagined is just so different to everything else. I'm a little bit over just European fantasy in which there's elves and, you know, they come marching in, and then the dwarves, and they might have different names, but really you've got to twist that kind of formula a lot to get something out of it, or just be a master like, you know, GRRM, who was able to just take these Western tropes and just put them up to 11. So, it's a little bit difficult because this is a sequel, but in the main story is Blackwing is the story of Reinhard Galharrow, who has kind of been pressed into service by the Nameless, who are like these super kind of wizards almost / gods, and they are trying to protect the world, the kingdom, whatever, from the Deep Kings, who are just these horrible people, things, and they create these ridiculous monsters. And so the big premise is that in this war between them, there was this cataclysm, and it created what is known as the Misery, which is this place that you can go into. It's like a no man's land, think of World War I, like, but magical apocalypse. And you can go in there, but weird stuff happens, and if you stay there too long, it can start to affect your health and all these kind of things. So in the first one, there was kind of a plot to to invade this city, which is right on the edge of the Misery, and various stuff happened I won't go into. And then this is the sequel. So really, if you're thinking of getting into this and you haven't read the first one, jump out, read them, then watch my review of the first one, and then come back and watch this review when you're finished. If you're just not quite sure, I'm not going to give everything away. But it is a sequel, so Reinhard Galharrow, which is no surprise, him and most of his team are back, and this one is slightly different in that it starts off much more like a detective noir, where it's quite slow. It's doing a lot of table setting, introducing some new characters and just setting up the world, and then it shifts incredibly around the middle mark. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of the reviews and a lot of stuff that I just see online really were quite critical of the first half of this book and loved the second half. Now, I'm the opposite, in that I absolutely love the first half because I'm in love with this world. I just think it is great, and I just want to know much more about the Misery and the Nameless ones and Deep Kings and the Drudge and the Darlings and everything which goes on in this. And I quite like the team that Galharrow has, and they're all so full on. So that table setting part for me is quite enjoyable, whereas the second half, which I'll talk about in spoilers, had some issues for me. But look, let's cut this short. If you're into grimdark, if you're into fantasy, go get Ravencry, Ed McDonald. I'm going to be back in a second, and we'll talk a little bit more freely in spoilers. Okay, we're in spoilers. So really, if you haven't read this book, I would probably stop now and come back later. So let's now talk about a little bit more detail about the premise of the book. So it's set 4 years after the events of Blackwing, and things are a little bit more settled in the world, like the Blackwing organization that Gal Harrow has set up. He's got some people like Valia, who's his kind of like right-hand office organizer, and she's really in charge of logistics and stuff, and that's helped them stay on top of things. But what has happened, there's a few elements which all start to come together. One of them is there's these seeings or these sightings of this lady who sometimes comes out of the Foz, which is this kind of light energy which they get from the moon. And we know that it's probably something to do with Eva Beth, who was Gal Harrow's lover and who really saved everything at the end of book one. So you're kind of not sure what's happening there, because from his point of view, is it too much wish fulfillment to think that somehow she's still alive? But what does happen, which is a very real human thing, is a cult starts to be established around the possibility that there's this kind of savior from the town and from the petty politics as well. So really becomes start of a thing like the poor people really like. It's just like a Virgin Mary kind of thing. The other thing which happens is very early on, there's a break-in. There's a few things which are real detective noir things. And then there's a break into the vault of the patron of Gal Harrow, and which he's kept all these horrible artifacts. And no one thought that anyone would ever go because it was warded, but also because all the artifacts are so dangerous, they'll just kill you. Anyway, they've stolen the Eye of Shavada, which was part of one of the Deep Kings who got destroyed at the end of book one. And that now puts into play this whole other faction, which takes a while to come about. I don't want to kind of ruin it completely, even though we're in spoilers. But anyway, that starts to build up so that you kind of got a very detective noir first half, and then you get on the roller coaster for the second half. Now that means at the middle of the book, something really different happens, and that is, because we're in spoilers, Gal Harrow is left behind after they try to stop this attack, which has been going, hitting the town with these kind of missiles each night. And so they do that, but in doing that, it's a massive military sacrifice, and Gal Harrow's left behind. So he, because he's scared of all the stuff that he knows about how the Empire's protected, he flees into the misery, which is really a death sentence. And something strange happens. He starts to absorb the misery. And in a way, Gal Harrow's, if you think, every hero has a thing which sets them apart, and that's why they're a hero. And his is he's got the Die Hard thing, which is, he just is impossible to kill. He just can take an incredible amount of damage. And if you can do that, he starts to absorb the misery to a degree which it's kind of speculated that no human could probably do, and therefore he starts to get some benefits from that, in that he's got some insight into it. So I found all that a little bit hard to accept, because I really loved more when it's a bit more grounded, and Gal Harrow's almost like a washed out detective who's, sure, he's dealing with all these fantastical things, but it's also his insight into humanity and how bad we can be. So all of a sudden now he's kind of like a borderline, like an X-Man, kind of mutant thing. And although I could see why they did that, because every step that Ed McDonald then takes from then on leads to the next, and it's almost like he had the ending and went, how am I going to get to the ending? If I worked backwards, it would have to have this step here where he goes in there. And then he makes it out of the misery, kind of impossible to be the only guy to do it. And I love Gal Harrow, so don't get me wrong. I mean, it's pretty mighty. And then he has to unravel this huge plot. And it's interesting, but the problem with this book is it's not like I ever thought Gal Harrow was going to be killed. And by definition, then I thought the plot would be stopped. And so we get to the fundamental problem with trilogies, not just this book, any book, which is the first book is great in establishing the world. Book 2, you got to move it on. It's got to have its own stakes and explore the world a bit more and tell you a bit more. But really its function is to then set up book 3. So I think book 3 will be amazing because there probably will be all bets are off, and it's a very violent trilogy. So, God knows what will happen. But look, this is the problem when you do these book reviews, is you start to sound very critical and down on something, because when you're talking about it, you've got to talk about what the problems are and what the positives are, and there's only so much you can do about positives. I just want to be very clear. This is a great book. If you love fantasy, read this book, get the series. Ed McDonald is a great writer. This is really good stuff. And if Ed McDonald ever sees this, you know what I want you to do, Ed? When you finish with the trilogy, I don't know what your plans are, but I'd love you to go back into that world and just do other stories. They don't have to be about Blackwing. They could just be about the Nameless. It could be over on the other side of the Misery, the Deep Kings. I'm in love with this book. I love all the weird creatures in the Misery. It's fantastic. Really, really good read. Anybody who's into fantasy, grimdark, should read it. Now, this is my next book, which I'll review next time. And this is Ed Kurtz, and I'm going to read this because it's a very strange title. The Rib from Which I Remake the World. And as anyone who's read all my reviews or listened to my book reviews, I have a fascination with weird horror. I'm attracted to fantasy, noir, Lovecraft, anything which cuts across those intersections. So if you think about it, Ravencry is very much like, weird fantasy, very grim. And this is very grim as well. Now, the interesting thing about this looks, it's textbook, weird kind of stuff. But I'm not quite sure how it got to the top of my reading list, which probably means it won an award. I can't remember which one. So we'll see. I've only read page 1. I'll be back soon with Mission Impossible 6, Fallout. Is it 6 or maybe 5? Can't remember. And if you like what I'm doing, press like. Even better, hit the bell and then you subscribe, and then you'll know when I do. I do normally about 1 or 2 a week. And I'm on Twitter at Guru Eden, and I'll talk to you then. Bye.